I'll be reading John chapter 6, verse 5 through 7. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite."
Preacher at the Pearl Harbor Church of Christ. And I asked him, I said, "Well, how did you end up being a preacher here?" And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, "Well, I'll tell you, I was over here for a visit, and the elders who were meeting with me asked me one question. They said, 'What do you like to preach about?' And he said, 'I like to preach about 15 minutes. So they hired him right on the spot there. So now I don't know if I'll speak for 15 minutes or I'll speak for, well, I hope I speak for 15 minutes. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But if I don't, you'll get today. So you're welcome. You are welcome. So we're going to, the scriptures for today are around an event that is covered in all four Gospels. If you know that, so the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels, and they're written about the same time. John was written much later, but there are 11 events that are covered in all four Gospels. All right, most of those are surrounding the crucifixion, and that's appropriate. But this is one that's covered in all four, so I think it deserves a little extra attention on our part. And let me pull all this up. Johnny's a little more coordinated than I am in all this, but I do have some information for you. So what I'd like to do is we'll spend a little time reading from the John version. I like the John version because, one, he already knew that most people knew about this event, all right, because they would have already read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of it. So he covers a few little details, but he leaves out some things, and we're going to try to capture that. So it's in John chapter 6, and if you wanted to kind of keep a thumb on the other, it's Matthew 14. So we're going to cover a little bit of both of those today. I probably should at least acknowledge that we have Carl and Jean here today. I don't know if you guys saw that or not. First time this year, so really, really good to see you guys. Lots of prayers have been offered your way. It's great to see you guys here. So let's go ahead and start at verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. All right, I already have questions. After these things, what are these things that caused him to do this? Well, Matthew gives us a little more detail. So I'm going to jump back to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13. When Jesus heard it, now you have to look back a little bit earlier than that. What had just happened was Jesus' friend, John the Baptist, was beheaded. All right? And when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And the John version says, after these things, they went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. Okay, so how big is the Sea of Galilee? Do you have a perspective on that? Do you know? So if you were to cross the Sea of Galilee at its widest point, it's about 7 or 8 miles. Okay, so it's not a huge, it's a lake. They call it the sea, but it's the Sea of Galilee, but it is a lake. It is a freshwater sea, and I don't know what the real distinguishment of there. It was a large lake, but they call it the Sea of Galilee. Now, they were up in the northern end of this lake, so he probably didn't go the entire width of it when he crossed this body of water. Bethsaida is kind of the north if I'm looking from your perspective, it's kind of on the north east side there, and that's where he landed there. So you have to realize that these people who were following him were coming on foot, and if he went 5 miles away, straight across, so they probably walked 6, 7, 8 miles to get to where Jesus was. Now Jesus, again, was trying to find a quiet space, a retreat for himself, to pray and to mourn the loss of his friend there. But people came. All right, why did they come? They had already seen him preaching. They've already seen him do miracles. So some of them wanted to continue to see these signs on there. And we've got some hints a little later in the chapter for you. Sticking back to John here. I probably wrote some things down that I'll forget, so bear with me as I... So picking up in verse 2, so that a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. Okay, so we know one reason. They want to see their signs. They were bringing their sick people to him. Being sick in this time was a big deal. There wasn't an urgent care center that you could run to every time you sprained an ankle or something like that, or broke an arm, or you had leprosy. All right, so Jesus healing these people, you would travel for that. I mean, that was a very important thing. You think a broken leg, you might die from that. So, I mean, it's a big deal to have somebody who can heal them. So they were following there. So, but Jesus, seeing all coming, he actually went up on the mountain again to try to get a little alone time, and he sat there with his disciples. In verse 4, John gives us a little hint of the timing of that. So, now the Passover feast was near. All right, it's a little bit of isolated sentence in the middle of this paragraph, but he's given some information for us. We know that this is in the springtime. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, and he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" I'm going to jump back again to Matthew on that because I think it's interesting, the contrast there and the details that John brings out. Picking up John 14, verse 15, when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, "This is a deserted place and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." Okay. Can you imagine? So there were 5,000 men, we know a little bit later, 5,000 men in this group, plus women, plus children. So how many people are there? 10,000? Maybe 20,000? Can you imagine if Jesus said, "Yeah, let's send them away"? And so 5,000 or 10,000 people wander into these towns looking for something to eat. All right, there's not a super Walmart there where people can just go and buy things. Most of these things trade on a marketplace. And they're busy in the mornings because they bake bread based on an anticipated group there. So you couldn't just show up and say, "Oh, here, let me just throw some bread in the oven to feed 5,000 men, 10,000 people." All right? And then I think there's something that's just funny to me, the solution there. So Philip, I think, is an accountant. He said, "Where shall we buy bread?" Jesus says, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? And Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them. How's your denarii to U.S. dollar conversion? You guys up on that? You have an idea? How much money are we talking about? 200 denarii. So a denarii is a day's wage for a laborer there. We've seen that when the parable of the garden, all right? So what's a day's wage worth in today's dollars? $100? $100 makes easy math, so let's just say that. So 200 denarii at $100 a denarii is $20,000. So Philip, extremely practical, he says, Jesus, we don't have $20,000 in our coffer right now to buy bread for these people, if there was any place even to buy bread. So it's a substantial amount of money for these things. So these people showed up. They followed Jesus for hours and hours. They showed up out there with nothing to eat for the most part. So there were 5,000 men that traveled. I can tell you the women did not plan this trip because women would have planned for food there. So they showed up there with no food, and Andrew actually is from this area, from Bethsaida. So he shows up, and I wish I could understand tone, because in verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish." Now, was he being sarcastic there? I can't imagine that Andrew would have been sarcastic to Jesus, but Jesus didn't need these 5 loaves or two fish to feed these 5,000 people. But it was important enough that all 4 of the Gospels mentioned that that's what they had available to them. So Jesus is able to make a whole lot with very little. You ever wonder about that kid? Why did that kid have 5 loaves of bread with him? I don't think he was going to eat 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And were these raw fish? Okay, I mean, it's just things I think about. So my guess is these are probably like dried fish, because they're easier to transport there. Because I don't think that Jesus was passing out sushi to everyone there. So 5 loaves and two fish there. That was probably the provision for that young boy's family there. And he was willing to give that up. He probably wasn't following. He was probably passing through and saw it and came up to it. We don't know. It's pure speculation. I don't think it really matters in the grand scheme of things. But it is interesting I'm going to hunt that guy down. I'm going to ask him one of these days, about how that all came to be. So, picking up in verse 10, then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down," that there was grass in this place. Now, some of the other Gospels actually give a little more detail on this. So he said, set them down in groups of 50. Do you understand the significance of that? That doesn't mean anything to us. I don't know how many people are here today. Maybe 75 or so, maybe 100. So set them down in groups of 50. This is how, if you were an army, you would distribute food to your soldiers. You would set them down in groups, and then you would pass it out to those groups right there. Can you imagine the things that were going through their head when Jesus said, set them down in groups of 50 to pass out food? They were already looking for the Messiah. They were already looking for the king. They were already looking for a military leader to overthrow the Romans. And here's a guy that can turn 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed an army. So there's a saying that's credited to Napoleon. It says an army marches on its stomach. Now what that's talking about is the supply line. In order for an army to be able to be successful, you have to be able to feed the army. And Jesus just made it incredibly simple. He can cover that. In fact, a little bit later, right after, the next day, that night, Jesus is walking on water. That's another impediment to an army, being able to cross bodies of water. So now all the people didn't see that, but his disciples saw that. So Jesus can feed an army with a very small amount of food, and he can cross rivers, cross seas, just by walking on top of that. So God, can you imagine how these guys are thinking right now? And Jesus took the loaves, and he had given thanks. He distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those who were sitting down. So, can you imagine the logistics of that? So Jesus actually touches every morsel of food and then passes it out. Just the time required to actually distribute that much food. I mean, you've seen just a fellowship here, right? We have lots of hands passing that out. Maybe there was 100 disciples passing food out. There would have taken some time for all this to happen. He also let them eat. Okay, so all this stuff happened in this one period of time. I mean, it's easy to read in one sentence, but these are real people, really things that happened there. Anyway, it's just very, very interesting to me through that process. And at the very end of verse 10 is a line that I think would be easy to miss there. As much as they wanted. How often do you think they ate as much as they wanted? I mean, that wasn't a common thing in this time. I mean, it's easy for us. Our problem with food is that we have too much or we eat too much. That was not the case in the first century. I mean, think of how much time was spent in the preparation, the gathering, the planning of a meal or meals for a period of time. It takes a lot of effort and energy. You had to build a fire. You had to grow your own garden. I mean, Joe has his own garden right there, but I think that if he didn't have it, he would still eat there. That was not the case there. I mean, how many occasions did you see in these times when famine would cause entire populations of people to move? No refrigeration, no microwaves. So it was a substantial deal, and it was unusual for them to actually be able to eat all that they wanted at one time. My grandmother, she was the oldest of 8 kids, and she told me, said they always had enough there. And she knew that they always had enough because if she ever reached for seconds, they said, "No, Thelma, you've had enough." So she knew she had enough. But I don't think that was the case here. I think that they it was a challenge to have all that you wanted. And Jesus said, "Gather up this is verse 12. Gather up the remains so that nothing is lost." It's still important. Plus, I think he wanted them to see the bounty that was created in there. There they gathered up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over that they had eaten. Then those men who had seen the sign that Jesus did said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." It's getting interesting now for them. Look in the very next verse 15 there. Then Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king. So this is how I know that they understood the military implications of what Jesus just did. They said, "This is the guy right here. This is the guy we've been waiting for." We came originally to see healing diseases, and gosh, wouldn't that be a clever thing if you had a soldier who was injured and Jesus could heal them there. He could feed them. He can travel on water. This is definitely the guy. But it wasn't Jesus' time, so he departed by the mountains for himself alone. So there's another time when Jesus is speaking. It's just in Matthew chapter 5. And it's a sentence, it's one scripture. Matthew 5 and verse 6. We already talked about how people understood what hunger was. Jesus gives them this line. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." So these people understood what it was to be hungry. They assumed that they were not going to eat, I suspect, when they went out after Jesus that day. That there was they had not made any provisions for food there. So I think that they fully expected that they were going to go hungry that day. Fasting is very big in this time. And I think some of it is when you don't have food, you're going to pray and you're going to take those opportunities to do those kinds of things. But what if we really hungered for righteousness today? I mean, we get hungry. We plan 3 times a day we're going to eat, right? Plus a couple of snacks in the middle there. And if I'm hungry, you can just go check in the fridge. There's something in there, or there's something in the pantry. What if you could replace that hunger for hungry for righteousness? What if the moment you got up that day, you planned, all right, I'm going to have a righteous moment. I'm going to pray. I'm going to try to become closer to God. I'm going to try to become right with God a minimum of 3 times a day. First of the day, the middle of the day, end of the day, a couple times maybe a little snack during the day. If you had that mindset going forward, this country's a different place. if everyone had that mindset? Or what if just the 129 people here had that amount of righteousness or that hunger for righteousness? How are you if you ever been around anybody that skipped a meal? They'll tell you about it usually, right? What if you're talking to somebody that said, you know what, I missed my prayer time today. If that was important enough that you felt you needed to share that with somebody, just like you would share you missed a meal today, or I'm dieting, I'm on a keto diet, let's say. If you just had I'm on an all prayer diet right now, you would tell everyone that you knew that was the case. So how do we get that? What do we need to do to actually have a hunger for righteousness there that Jesus is talking about here? It's a real challenge for us. Now, one meal a day might have been all they could have managed in that time. But if we can eat more, could we hunger for righteousness more with all that we have? I mean, we spend, let's face it, zero time, an hour maybe a day planning for food, and they might have spent 6 hours a day. So you're going to replace that time. Instead, we filled it with dumb stuff, right? If I'm being honest. We filled our time with dumb stuff. Instead of filling our time with dumb stuff, we focused on the righteousness of being more righteous. So I don't know how we get that. It takes a personal commitment to do that. It takes a time to do that. It takes accountability to do that. Finding someone to be your dieting partner, right? That's a real thing. People that they diet together because it's easier. What if you had a righteousness partner as well? Somebody to help hold you accountable for what you do or you don't do, or somebody that you can share your victories with. Hey, I was able to pray 3 times today, and someone can say, well, you know what, that's good. I wasn't able to do it. Help hold me accountable for that. So that's what this body is here for today. We're here to help hold each other accountable. We're really good at feeding each other food. How about if we get better at feeding each other righteousness out there? So today, if we can commit to each other for that, there may be some of you who haven't come into the kitchen full time. You're just visiting there. So you may need prayers from this congregation. You may need to be baptized to actually identify with Jesus' body. So today, let's all stand and sing. And if you need prayers of the church, you need help, please come forward.